Hi, and thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the joints in our body, and we're going to experience some of them as we are talking about them. So I wanted to bring you back to the 6 types of joints that we have in the human body. First of all, we have plantar joints. Plantar joints are found in places like the SI joint. We then have hinge joints. Hinge joints are found in the elbow or the knee. We have pivot joints and we have condyloid joints. Condyloid joints are found in places like the wrist, and they allow for flexion and extension in multiple planes of movement. We also have saddle joints like we find in the thumb, and we have ball and socket joints. Now for yoga, we deal primarily with ball and socket joints and hinge joints. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Our shoulders and our hips are both ball and socket joints. These joints come together when a piece of bone, so either your scapula or your pelvis, comes in contact with a long bone, either your femur or your humerus. It comes in contact like this. So this would be an example of a ball and socket joint. This is my example of the hip socket engaged with the femoral head. Now, as you see, the femur can turn in the hip socket, and it can move around in the hip socket, right? It can move forwards and backwards and side to side. This is an example of a ball and socket joint. Our knees, on the other hand, they can't move side to side. They move forwards and backwards. They move along their axis, and that is their range of motion. So we automatically see the difference here between a ball and socket joint and a hinge joint. Our ball and socket joints have a lot more mobility. Our hinge joints don't have as much mobility. Now, to complicate matters even further, the hinge joints of our knees, for example, are tied into the pelvic girdle through the IT band. This means that if my pelvis is misaligned, it will directly affect my knees. So, let's take a look at the pelvis once again. Here, I have my hip flexors, and the hip flexor is actually made up of one of the quadriceps and the psoas major and minor. My hip extenders are my glutes here and my hamstrings here. And so when I want to extend my hips away from the midline, my glutes come into play, as do my hamstrings. When I want to bring my femur closer to my body, say in a low lunge, then I'm activating my hip flexors. My psoas, major and minor, and one of my quadriceps has now engaged to bring this leg forward. So in this situation, like for example, low lunge, you can be in a low lunge and not be active in your engagement. And this is what we want to look out for in our students. Just because the hip flexor and the hip extenders are the primary movers, right? They make up the primary and secondary movement in the asana practice, doesn't mean that the rest of the muscles aren't turned on. We need to cue them to turn those muscles on. And so in our low lunge, for example, we would really focus on bringing awareness to the foot, engaging pada bandha, so pressing into all 4 corners of the foot, feeling that inner arch lift. That inner arch lift turns on my abductors and adductors, my inner thighs, and I can then start to engage my quads. So really pressing in, engage my quads. Now, all of the quads are not going to engage. It's really my hip flexor that is engaged right now, and I can feel that. I can feel what's engaged and what's not engaged, what's not engaged, what's engaged. So from that place, I can see what I'm looking for in my students. Now, the back leg is an extension. My Glutes are trying really hard to turn on. My glutes are pretty weak, actually. So I have to really focus that. I have to focus my awareness on that. And in order to focus your students' awareness on turning on their glutes and their back leg, you can tell them to press their back foot into the ground. This turns on the quads and it turns on the glutes, and they get more active engagement in the back leg. Okay? Now, when we're in poses like this, our half splits, my hip flexors are still engaged. So my psoas and my hip flexor, the quadricep that is my hip flexor, and my psoas are engaged. My leg is in an extended position. My knee is extended. Okay? And this is a great way to build flexibility in the hamstrings while still helping your students to build strength in the hip flexors. And the shoulders are, again, a ball and socket joint married to a hinge joint. So we're starting to see a lot of similarities between the pelvic girdle and the shoulder girdle. When we're in postures like downward facing dog, we need to have our shoulders engaged, and everything needs to be working together to maintain integrity in the shoulders. So in order to do that, so we're not dumping out in the shoulders, we use our arms in external rotation to keep a broadening in the front of the chest so that the shoulder blades can fully be articulated onto the back of the body. Now, what does that even mean, articulation of the shoulder blades? Well, to me, it means that the shoulders are where they're supposed to be based on the rule of scapular-humeral rhythm. The scapular-humeral rhythm is the principle that for every 2 degrees the humerus raises, the scapula will raise 1 degree. So, for example, if my arms raise to this level, then my scapula has moved 1 degree for every 2 degrees my arms have moved. If I move my arms into full flexion, then my scapula is actually up around the upper ribs because of scapular-humeral rhythm. This is a function of the humerus head being attached to the glenoid in the glenoid-humeral joint. In order to make sure that this shoulder girdle is in alignment in positions like downward facing dog, plank pose, or even in positions like chaturanga, we try to get the upper arms to externally rotate. So we want the upper arms to externally rotate so that we have this broadening in the front of the body. This helps us to maintain integrity in the back of the body. So we keep this. As you can see, my palms and my elbows are facing forward. I raise my arms into flexion. Well, at some point, I have to bring my hands back towards the mat. I won't be able to take downward dog or plank like this. So then I turn the forearms in. So we have external rotation in the upper arms, internal rotation in the forearms to maintain integrity in the shoulders. The range of motion that we have in a particular joint system is directly related to its primary joint structure. So for example, the range of motion that I have in my hips is directly related to the integrity of my pelvic girdle. The range of motion I have in my shoulders is directly related to the integrity of my shoulder girdle. If I'm using some muscles and not using others, or if I'm hypermobile and I don't have strength, or if I have a lot of strength and I don't have mobility, then we need to work the opposite to get to a balanced state. Many of our students will not have the mobility to move the shoulders up into flexion, completely into flexion, or back into extension. Some of our students won't have the flexibility or the mobility in their pelvis to sit in Sukhasana, a comfortable, easy seat. To help them as they're working towards this more expanded range of motion and greater mobility, you can offer props like sitting up on a block or a bolster. You can even put blocks underneath your students' hands in downward facing dog. These will help to make space so that they can find more ease in their practice. In yoga, we don't work very much with the finite joints of like the hands or the feet, for example, in isolation. We will work with engaging Hasta Bandha and Pada Bandha, and that's a great thing to cue in your classes. Engagement of Hasta Bandha is pressing into the four corners of the hands. Engaging Pada Bandha is pressing into the four corners of the feet. You can actually feel the arches lift up, especially if you lift the toes up. This helps our students to increase the flexibility in these tiny joints in the feet and the hands without us having to isolate each joint or isolate the foot as a whole, right? Or the hand as a whole. It gives us the opportunity to help them to maintain flexibility in those parts of their body without calling them out or without spending a lot of time explaining them. Our wrist can have a lot of inflammation. And many people spend all day typing on computers, and it's important to give them options if their wrists are tender or if they're experiencing carpal tunnel syndrome. Placing blocks underneath the hands in downward dog or plank pose can help students alleviate some of the pressure and take some of the angle off of that flexion that they're feeling in the wrist. So the next time you have a student who asks you how to deal with that, you can offer them blocks underneath the hands.